The screech of microphone feedback cut through the low hum of the Tulsa Country Club ballroom. 200 guests in tailored suits and heavy silk went dead silent. At the head table, bathed in the glow of a rented crystal chandelier, my mother Sylvia tapped the microphone. She held out a silver pen, pointing it toward the shadows at the back of the room. "Cora, sweetheart," she said, her voice dripping with a practiced, suffocating warmth, "just sign the paper. Let us not embarrass Vanessa tonight. It is just your little dirt project." I sat at a circular table near the swinging kitchen doors. A busboy stood frozen beside me, a tray of empty appetizer platters balanced on his shoulder. On the cheap linen in front of me sat a blank quitclaim deed printed on heavy legal stock. Signing it meant quietly surrendering the only asset keeping the Torres family out of bankruptcy. Refusing meant ruining my younger sister's $10 million commercial real estate deal in front of the wealthiest people in Oklahoma. I did not pick up the pen. I did not yell. I just kept my eyes fixed on the televisions mounted above the mahogany bar directly behind my mother's head. The bartender had left the screens muted, tuned to a national financial news network. Right as Sylvia tapped the microphone a second time to prompt me, the ticker tape at the bottom of the screen vanished. A bold red breaking news banner flashed across the monitors. The headline took up half the screen. Tech giant abandons data centers for $50 million drought-resilient agriculture initiative. Right next to those words was a high-resolution photograph of my face. My name is Cora Torres. I'm 34 years old, and I did not sign that paper. But what happened in that ballroom over the next 3 minutes is the reason the Torres family name no longer opens doors in Tulsa society. Welcome back to Pan of Vengeance, where we sit with the hard family moments and the quiet, lawful turns that follow them. We do not shout here. We do not throw glasses. We just examine the load-bearing math of a lie, and we watch what happens when gravity finally takes over. Tell me how old you are and where you are listening from down in the comments. If you have ever been the family scapegoat, the one expected to fix the cracked foundation while everyone else takes credit for the view, this story is for you. Drop a comment to let me know you are here, and be sure to hit subscribe. To understand how a silver pen and a muted television dismantled a local dynasty, you have to understand the dirt beneath our feet. I am a soil microbiologist. My laboratory sits on the edge of a 500-acre legacy ranch an hour outside the city. My days are spent studying mycelial networks, the invisible, microscopic fungal threads that bind soil together. Those threads are the only reason rainwater stays in the ground during a punishing Oklahoma summer. They are the only reason the land does not dry up and blow away in the wind. You never see the roots. You only see the green grass on the surface. My family is obsessed with the surface. They care about the paint on the house, the badge on the car hood, the label sewn into the collar. For years, I was the invisible network holding them together, quietly absorbing their debts and swallowing their daily insults. They called my federal research useless. They called my life a waste. They had no idea who actually owned the ground they were standing on. Growing up in the Torres house meant learning your specific place in the display case. My father, Richard, inherited the ranch from his grandfather. He liked the title of rancher, but he hated the smell of livestock and the long, unglamorous hours of fence repair. He preferred golf shirts and board meetings that produced nothing but bar tabs. My mother, Sylvia, viewed the ranch not as a working ecosystem, but as a sprawling, scenic backdrop for her country club luncheons. She bought imported patio furniture while the tractors rusted in the barn. Then there was Vanessa. My younger sister by 4 years, Vanessa possessed the exact kind of loud, shiny confidence my parents valued. She went into commercial real estate, selling glass boxes in the city to developers. She wore crisp white blazers and drove European cars with leather seats that always smelled brand new. I was the other daughter, the one who came home with soil under her fingernails, the one who preferred the quiet hum of a laboratory incubator over the clinking ice of a cocktail hour. When I chose a public university to study environmental science instead of a private college for business, my mother acted like I had committed a crime. I remember standing in the kitchen holding my acceptance letter. Sylvia did not even look up from her tablet. She just sighed and asked how I planned to afford a life playing in the mud. She told me the family could not support a hobby that did not produce a return on investment. I learned early that in my family, love was a transaction. If you did not look good on a country club Christmas card, you were a liability. So I stopped trying to look good. I leaned into the work. I learned how to identify the subtle shifts in soil acidity, how to isolate the fungi that helped crops survive when the rain stopped coming. I earned my doctorate, funded by grants and fellowships my parents never bothered to understand. I learned that the things holding a structure together are almost never visible from the outside. Whenever Vanessa visited the ranch, she would park her pristine car far away from my greenhouse, as if the dust itself might infect her. She would walk into the house complaining about the smell of fertilizer, waving a manicured hand in front of her face. She treated me not like an older sister, but like the hired help. Once during a summer barbecue, she asked me to fetch her another drink right in front of her friends. When I told her the cooler was right next to her, she laughed, a thin, bright sound designed to cut. She told her friends that scientists lack basic social skills because we spend too much time talking to worms. My father covered his mouth to hide his smile. My mother told me to stop being difficult and just get the drink. I got the drink. I handed the cold, sweating can to my sister, and I watched the way she took it without making eye contact. It is a strange, specific kind of loneliness to realize your family prefers you as a servant rather than an equal. I filed that moment away, along with 100 others just like it. I did not argue. I went back to my lab. I knew arguing with people committed to their own vanity is like trying to plant seeds in concrete. You just waste your own energy. While I was looking down at the health of the earth, my parents were looking away from the health of their bank accounts. The ranch was bleeding money. For years, my father took out quiet loans to cover his losses, borrowing against the legacy he refused to actually manage. He bought new trucks while the fences rotted. He paid for my mother's galas while the property taxes went into default. They kept up the country club memberships, pretending the drought had not touched them, pretending the cattle market had not shifted, pretending the walls were not cracking. I saw the cracks. I saw them in the final notice letters left sitting on the entryway table. I saw them in the way my father's hands shook when the phone rang during dinner. I saw the foundation giving way. In my line of work, when the soil loses its structural integrity, a collapse is inevitable. You cannot negotiate with physics. You cannot charm gravity. The Torres family was standing on hollow ground. They just did not know that the quiet daughter they mocked for playing in the dirt was the only one holding the deed to the safety net. But to show you how that trap was set, we have to go back 5 years to a cold, sterile bank office and a secret my father begged me to keep. 7 years ago, the air inside the Torres ranch house smelled of roasting sage and imported floor wax. It was Thanksgiving, but my mother Sylvia did not view holidays as occasions for familial warmth. She viewed them as quarterly earnings reports delivered over bone china plates. She had spent the entire morning directing a hired catering crew, arranging decorative gourds into an elaborate centerpiece that took up half the dining table. I stood by the kitchen island, wearing a simple dark sweater, holding a glass of tap water, watching her meticulously measure the distance between the silver forks with her thumb. She needed the environment to look flawless for her specific audience. The audience, of course, was Vanessa. My sister arrived 45 minutes late, a calculated delay to ensure we were all waiting for her entrance. She did not pull her vehicle around to the side gravel lot where I parked my weather-beaten field truck. Instead, she drove directly up the circular driveway, parking right in front of the sweeping porch, her tires crushing the manicured edge of my mother's prized lawn. We all walked out to the steps to greet her. Sitting in the afternoon sun was a brand-new imported sports sedan. It was painted a stark, blinding white, with a pristine leather interior that still carried the sharp chemical scent of the factory floor. Vanessa stepped out wearing a tailored cashmere coat, tossing her blonde hair over her shoulder. She dangled the heavy key fob from her index finger, letting the silver metal catch the sunlight. My father, Richard, whistled low, shaking his head in deep admiration. Sylvia clapped her hands together, rushing down the wooden steps to embrace her youngest daughter. They circled the vehicle, running their palms over the polished hood, praising the engine specifications they did not comprehend. Vanessa bragged about the closing price on her latest commercial real estate listing, tossing out impressive-sounding financial figures. I stood on the top step, watching the scene unfold with the clinical detachment of a scientist observing a predictable reaction. My trained eye noticed the small paper tag taped to the inside of the windshield. It was a lease. The car was not an asset she owned outright. It was a high-interest rental, a liability wrapped in European steel designed to project a level of wealth she had not yet earned. But to my parents, the illusion was all that mattered. They worshipped the shiny metal shell. We moved into the formal dining room. Sylvia placed Vanessa at the right hand of my father, the traditional seat of honor. I was assigned the folding chair near the swinging door that led to the kitchen. It was the exact same chair I always occupied, a physical reminder of my utility in this house. During the meal, my father poured expensive red wine and held court. He spun exaggerated tales about expanding the cattle herd and buying adjacent acreage. None of it was true. The barn roof had been leaking since March, and he had quietly sold off the last of our grazing steers 2 years prior to cover his debts. But Richard preferred the comfort of a grand lie over the cold reality of a balanced ledger. Vanessa dominated the rest of the conversation. She talked loudly about her upcoming vacation to a coastal resort and the wealthy developers she courted at her agency down in the city. She name-dropped local politicians and country club presidents, painting a picture of a glamorous, high-stakes life. My parents hung on her every word. They nodded eagerly and raised their crystal glasses repeatedly to toast her phantom achievements. I waited for a lull in the noise. I had spent the last 5 years working 80-hour weeks in a university laboratory, living on instant coffee and meager fellowship stipends. Just 3 days prior, my doctoral committee had approved my final dissertation. The grueling paperwork was signed. The title was officially mine. I thought perhaps just this once the milestone might be large enough to earn a fraction of the pride they showered on my sister for signing a lease document. I set my silver fork down on my ceramic plate. The soft clink of metal drew their attention for a fraction of a second. I cleared my throat and looked directly at my father. I defended my dissertation on Tuesday, I said, keeping my tone even and calm. The review board passed it without any revisions. I earned my doctorate. A heavy, suffocating silence dropped over the dining table. The antique grandfather clock in the hallway ticked 3 loud times. I watched my father's eyes dart toward my mother, waiting for her to dictate the appropriate reaction. He never formed his own opinions when Sylvia was in the room. He lacked the basic spine required to lead his own family. Sylvia reached out and took a slow, deliberate sip of her dark wine. She set the glass down, leaving a faint red smudge on the delicate rim. She looked at me from across the table, her expression hardening into a familiar mask of supreme disappointment. "Well, Cora," she said, her voice adopting that thin, airy tone she usually reserved for dismissing the waitstaff at her luncheons, "I suppose congratulations are in order, though I still do not understand why you spent your entire youth earning a useless degree in playing with dirt." The words hung in the air, hovering over the roasted turkey and the imported centerpieces. Playing with dirt. Years of isolating microscopic fungi, mapping ecological survival structures, unlocking patents that could save dying farmlands, reduced to a playground insult by a woman who could not successfully identify a single native plant in her own backyard. My father let out a short, nervous chuckle. He looked down at his plate, rearranging his mashed potatoes, unable to meet my gaze. His cowardice was as predictable as the sunrise. He would never defend me if it meant risking his wife's temporary displeasure. Vanessa seized the opportunity to shine even brighter. She leaned back in her upholstered chair, twirling the stem of her wineglass with manicured fingers. "Come on, Mom, do not be harsh," she said, a cruel smirk playing on her painted lips. "Cora is going to save the earth, even if it means she will be making $30,000 a year for the rest of her natural life. We cannot all be cut out for the real business world. You know, the one where people actually make money." Sylvia laughed, a bright, ringing sound that filled the room and bounced off the walls. Richard joined in, chuckling at the perceived cleverness of his youngest daughter. They raised their glasses to each other, toasting the sharp wit that had just cut me down to the bone. I sat in the chair by the kitchen door, and I felt something shift deep inside my chest. It was not sorrow. It was not the stinging heat of a temper tantrum. It was a cold, quiet, structural realization. In my field, I study how strong trees send nutrients through underground networks to sustain the weaker saplings. My family operated in the exact opposite manner. They extracted energy from the strong to fund the flashy. You cannot reason with people who derive their self-worth from your humiliation. They did not want a successful older daughter. They wanted a baseline of failure they could point to, so Vanessa would appear taller by comparison. The old version of me might have argued. The naive girl might have tried to explain the lucrative federal grants, the global implications of soil stabilization, the sheer rigorous science of my chosen field. But sitting at that table, watching them laugh over their expensive wine, I simply stopped trying. I picked up my water glass and took a steady sip. I did not speak another word for the rest of the dinner. I cleared the dirty plates while they retired to the living room. I washed the dishes in the sink while they admired Vanessa's leased car through the front bay window. I realized that night that silence was my only armor. I stopped offering them pieces of my life to tear apart. I stopped hoping they would look past the mud on my work boots and see the value of the analytical mind inside my head. I buried myself entirely in my research, turning my focus downward into the complex root systems that never asked for an audience to validate their existence. I let my family keep their shiny surface world. I thought my silence would keep the peace. I thought if I stayed out of their way, if I asked for nothing and offered nothing, they would eventually leave me to my own devices. I believed I was building a permanent boundary. I did not understand that in a toxic ecosystem, silence is never interpreted as a boundary. It is interpreted as a blank check. When you refuse to speak, they assume you agree with their distorted version of reality. They take your quiet endurance as permission to push harder, to demand more, to extract every ounce of utility you possess without ever issuing a single word of gratitude. I thought I was protecting my mental peace by walking away from the fight. But silence is a debt that compounds. How much is my silence actually costing me? 5 years ago, the decay of the Torres property was no longer something you could hide with imported patio furniture. The signs of financial ruin were etched into the landscape itself. The wooden fence posts along the main highway leaned inward, rotting at the base. The heavy machinery sat dead in the barn, with engines seized from years of neglected maintenance. Yet my mother Sylvia still hosted her weekly country club luncheons on the wraparound porch, serving expensive champagne while the roof shingles curled and peeled above her guests' heads. She demanded the aesthetic of wealth, even as the reality of poverty chewed through the floorboards. I discovered the truth on a humid Tuesday afternoon. I had driven out to the acreage to collect soil samples from the lower basin. Walking through the kitchen to grab a glass of tap water, I noticed a thick stack of mail shoved carelessly into the junk drawer near the refrigerator. A bright pink slip of paper caught my eye, peeking out from beneath glossy catalog magazines. It was a final notice of foreclosure from the county tax assessor. My father, Richard, had not paid the property taxes in 36 months. He had taken out a secondary loan against the equity to fund Sylvia's lavish lifestyle and Vanessa's early career networking parties. When the cattle market dipped and the loans matured, he simply stopped opening his mail. He buried his head in the sand, hoping the mathematics of his failure would somehow forget to work. The bank was 72 hours away from seizing the 500 acres and auctioning our family legacy to the highest bidder. I confronted him in his study. He sat behind his heavy oak desk looking small and gray, resembling a deflated balloon. He did not yell. He just wept quietly into his palms, begging me not to tell Sylvia. He said the shame would kill him. He confessed he had no plan and no money. he was a hollow structure waiting for the wind to knock him over. He asked me what he should do, as if I were the parent and he was the frightened child. I left his study without saying a single comforting word. I drove straight back to my small apartment in the city and opened my laptop. I did not panic, because panic is a useless emotion when you are trying to stabilize a collapsing trench. I simply looked at the load-bearing math. The numbers were grim, but they were solvable if I acted swiftly and without sentiment. 48 hours later, I sat alone in a sterile conference room at the regional bank in downtown Tulsa. The air conditioning hummed a low, constant drone over the cheap commercial carpet. A senior loan officer named Mr. Henderson sat across from me, sliding a towering stack of legal documents across the polished mahogany table. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and deep confusion. He knew my father's reputation in town. He knew the estate was a sinking ship taking on water fast. He did not understand why a young scientist was sitting in his office preparing to drain her entire life savings to plug a hole she did not create. I had accumulated $90,000 in a high-yield savings account. It was the culmination of every fellowship stipend, every grant surplus, every single weekend I spent working in the university lab instead of taking vacations. I wired every penny to the bank to clear the immediate default. But the personal savings alone were not enough to cure the massive secondary loans Richard had secured. That is where my professional research saved the land. I had recently earned a prestigious federal agricultural grant designed to protect drought-vulnerable acreage in the Midwest. The federal grant provided the remaining capital needed to satisfy the bank in full. But I am an engineer of ecosystems. I know that if you feed a parasite, it will only grow hungry again. If I simply handed the money to my father, he would leverage the property within a year to buy my mother another country club membership or fund another one of Vanessa's least luxury vehicles. I needed a structural failsafe to ensure my life savings did not evaporate into their vanity. I told Mr. Henderson I was not paying off my father's debt as a charitable gift. I was executing a purchase. The paperwork we filed that cold Thursday morning executed a legal severance. In Oklahoma property law, you can divide a parcel of land into different estates. I used my funds and the federal grant to purchase the deep agricultural rights, the mineral rights, and the subsurface water covenants for the entire 500 acres. The deed was placed entirely in my name, Cora Torres, sole grantee. My parents were left with the surface deed. They owned the dirt you could touch with your shoe, the manicured lawn, the paved driveway, and the physical structure of the house. But they owned nothing beneath it. They could not drill a well. They could not mine for resources. They could not alter the fundamental use of the land without the explicit legal consent of the subsurface rights holder. They owned the paint on the walls, but I owned the concrete foundation. Mr. Henderson stamped the final page and handed me the recorded deeds. The heavy stock paper felt cool against my palms. I did not frame those documents. I did not put them in a pristine safety deposit box. I slid them into a plain manila folder. I walked out of the bank, got into my field truck, and opened the glove box. I tucked the folder underneath a stack of old tire receipts and vehicle registration manuals. I closed the glove box, listening to the sharp mechanical click of the latch. That plain manila folder became a silent passenger in my life. It traveled with me to every job site, every university lecture, every strained holiday dinner. It was a loaded weapon, sitting quietly in the dark, waiting for a war I hoped would never arrive. When I returned to the house that evening, I handed my father the clearance receipts. I explained the legal severance plainly. I told him he and Sylvia could live in the residence for the rest of their natural lives. They could keep their patio furniture and their illusions. But the earth itself was now under federal protection via my research institute. He could never borrow against the deep rights again. Richard looked at the receipts, and the remaining color drained from his face. He nodded once, a jerky, terrified motion. He promised he understood the new arrangement. By the following Sunday, the history of that agonizing week had already been rewritten. Sylvia hosted a celebratory brunch on the wraparound porch, pouring expensive mimosas for her wealthy friends. Vanessa arrived in her leased car, boasting about her latest commercial real estate leads. I sat on the perimeter, holding my quiet glass of tap water, watching the fiction take root in real time. Sylvia stood up and raised her crystal glass. She toasted my father, praising his brilliant financial acumen. She told the assembled guests that Richard had executed a shrewd corporate restructuring to optimize the family assets. She beamed with pride, describing how her husband had outsmarted the regional bank executives, securing the legacy for generations to come. Richard sat at the head of the table, soaking in the unearned applause. He looked right past me. He did not offer a single word of correction. He accepted the blind praise for a rescue he did not orchestrate, funded by a daughter he openly mocked. Vanessa chimed in, laughing about how the bank analysts were no match for the Torres business instincts. She looked over at me, her lips curling into a condescending smile. She told the guests it was a very good thing Dad handled the grown-up math, so I could keep playing in my little greenhouse without ever worrying about the real world. I took a slow sip of my water. I felt the shape of the key in my pocket, the small metal key that unlocked the glove box of my truck parked 100 yards away. I could have stopped the brunch right then. I could have walked out to the driveway, retrieved the manila folder, and laid the recorded deeds on the glass patio table. I could have watched the arrogance drain from my mother's face as she realized her prestigious legacy was legally owned by the family disappointment. But I stayed silent. I told myself I was being the bigger person. I told myself that letting them keep their foolish pride was the easiest way to protect my vital research. I thought I was purchasing long-term peace. I was wrong. You cannot purchase peace from people who use your silence as building material for their own delusions. My family took my quiet sacrifice and twisted it into proof of their own superiority. They spent the next 5 years walking across my land, breathing my air and drinking my water, all while telling their friends I was a failure who contributed nothing to the family name. They believed their own lies so deeply it became their reality. They forgot they only owned the surface. They forgot that gravity always wins when the ground beneath you is hollow. And as Vanessa began spending her days courting commercial developers in the city, the illusion was bound to collide with the mathematical truth. What happens when a family builds its entire identity on a foundation they do not actually own? Fast forward 5 years to the present day. The fragile piece I thought I purchased had hardened into a suffocating routine. I spent my days in the university laboratory and my evenings out in the field running soil diagnostics. My parents spent their days maintaining their country club facade, while my sister Vanessa climbed the ranks of the commercial real estate world. We existed in parallel universes, sharing the same zip code, but breathing entirely different air. Then the phone rang on a Tuesday afternoon. Sylvia demanded my presence for a historic family dinner. She did not ask if I was available. She simply stated the time and hung up, leaving a sharp click humming in my ear. I drove my battered field truck up the long gravel driveway as the sun dipped below the Oklahoma horizon. The dining room was already glowing with warm amber light. When I walked through the heavy front doors, the air smelled of expensive catered steak and top-shelf scotch. The good china was set out on the long mahogany table. Vanessa sat in the center of the room, practically vibrating with a smug electric energy. Richard was pouring dark liquor into crystal glasses. Sylvia was wearing a new pearl necklace, her posture rigid with an overwhelming sense of triumph. I took my seat in the usual metal folding chair near the kitchen doors. Nobody offered me a drink. Nobody asked about the federal grant renewal I had just secured for my research institute. The entire room was oriented around my younger sister. Vanessa waited until we were all seated before she stood up. She did not bother with pleasantries. She reached into her designer leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, glossy presentation folder. She dropped it right in the center of the dining table. The heavy paper slapped against the polished wood, echoing through the silent room. "I did it," she announced, her voice echoing with supreme unearned confidence. "I secured the buyer for the ranch." Sylvia let out a theatrical gasp, pressing her manicured hands to her chest. Richard set his scotch glass down so hard the amber liquid sloshed over the rim. Vanessa opened the folder to reveal a series of sleek architectural renderings. They depicted towering glass structures, sprawling concrete parking lots, and manicured artificial landscaping sitting right on top of our native grazing pastures. "It is a Silicon Valley tech firm," she explained, gesturing to the glossy pages like a museum curator unveiling a masterpiece. "They are expanding their operations into the Midwest. They need a sprawling footprint for a mega data center, and they want our acreage. The zoning is perfect. The highway access is ideal. I brokered the deal myself. $10 million. A breathless silence fell over the room. $10 million. It was an unfathomable sum, a golden ticket that would permanently erase every hidden debt and quiet humiliation my parents had accumulated over the last decade. Sylvia stood up and wrapped her arms around Vanessa's neck, kissing her cheek repeatedly. Richard raised his crystal glass, his eyes shining with tears of profound relief. They looked at my sister as if she had personally descended from the heavens to deliver them from their own incompetence. I sat in my corner, looking at the glossy renderings. My scientific brain immediately went to work, stripping away the shiny glass facades and analyzing the structural reality of the proposal. A mega data center houses tens of thousands of high-capacity computer servers operating around the clock. Servers generate an immense amount of heat. To prevent catastrophic hardware failure, facilities of that magnitude require industrial cooling systems. Those cooling systems require millions of gallons of water. Our region was locked in a devastating multi-year drought. The surface creeks had dried to cracked mud months ago. The only reliable water source was the deep subsurface aquifer, the exact aquifer tied directly to the subterranean covenants I legally purchased 5 years ago. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. I looked directly at my sister. "Did you check the subsurface water covenants?" I asked. My voice was quiet, but it sliced through the celebratory noise like a scalpel. Sylvia's joyous smile instantly vanished. Richard shot me a warning glare, clenching his jaw. Vanessa stopped pointing at the blueprints. She looked at me, rolling her eyes, letting out a sharp, patronizing sigh. "Always trying to ruin the moment, Cora," she said, shaking her head. "Always looking for a reason to drag us down into the dirt with you." I kept my gaze steady. "I am just asking a basic engineering question, Vanessa. A facility that size requires immense cooling capacity. They cannot pull that volume from the municipal grid out here. They will need to drill deep industrial wells. Did you pull the deep title history?" Vanessa let out a harsh, mocking laugh. She took a slow sip of her wine, enjoying the opportunity to educate her foolish older sister. "Commercial real estate is about surface acreage and highway access," she said, speaking slowly as if addressing a toddler. "I am not digging through decades of irrelevant farm archives. I had my 22-year-old junior paralegal run a standard baseline title sweep this morning. It took her 20 minutes. The surface deed is clear. The boundary lines are established. Nobody cares about the mud beneath the grass, Cora. They are paving over it." She had outsourced the most critical legal review of a $10 million transaction to an entry-level assistant who only checked the surface register. Her own sheer arrogance had blinded her to the most fundamental rule of land acquisition. She only looked at the paint on the house. She never checked the foundation. Richard cleared his throat, interrupting the tension. He reached into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. "Let us not listen to the poverty mindset tonight," he said, his voice thick with authority. "We have a real reason to celebrate." He pulled out a heavy rectangular piece of woven bank paper. He laid it gently in the center of the mahogany table, right next to the glossy architectural renderings. It was a cashier's check drawn from a prominent Silicon Valley financial institution, made out to Richard and Sylvia Torres. 7 figures. A staggering, monumental sum. "It is the earnest money," Richard announced, his chest puffing out. "A non-refundable escrow deposit to lock in the preliminary surface contract while they finalize the architectural permits. The developers wired it this afternoon. It is ours to keep no matter what happens." The room exploded into a frenzy of sheer greed. Sylvia reached out, tracing the printed zeros on the bank paper with a trembling, manicured fingernail. She immediately began listing her plans. She talked about hiring contractors to renovate the ranch house, purchasing a luxury penthouse condo down in the city, and throwing a lavish gala at the country club to announce the sale to all her high society friends. Vanessa leaned back in her chair, discussing the staggering commission she was about to collect. She talked about leaving her current agency and opening her own boutique brokerage firm with her name in gold letters on the door. I sat back in my metal folding chair. The crisp, heavy check lay in the center of the table, radiating an undeniable gravity. I watched the villains of my story taste absolute victory. It is a uniquely frustrating sting to witness people who delight in your humiliation suddenly handed a golden parachute. They had mocked my education. They had drained my savings. They had treated me like a servant in my own childhood home. And now they were sitting around a table holding a legitimate, verified, 7-figure deposit for a $10 million windfall. To the untrained eye, they had won. The paper was real. The dark ink printed by the bank was real. The funds had cleared the wire transfer. But I knew the biological and legal reality of the earth beneath our feet. I knew that the Silicon Valley developers were brilliant engineers. They would never break ground on a massive data center without securing the deep water rights required to keep their servers from melting. When their corporate attorneys eventually dug past the junior paralegal's lazy surface sweep, they would discover the severance. They would discover that Richard and Sylvia were selling a mirage. I did not say another word for the rest of the dinner. I ate my catered steak in silence, watching my mother plan an extravagant future. I watched my father pour another round of expensive scotch, celebrating his financial genius. I watched my sister bask in the glow of a deal that was legally doomed. They had a staggering check in hand. They felt invincible. But what happens when you start spending a fortune that legally cannot belong to you? The morning after the dinner, the atmosphere at the Torres Ranch shifted from quiet desperation to manic, unchecked euphoria. My parents did not view the heavy escrow check as a preliminary legal deposit meant to be held safely until the transaction formally closed. To people who had spent a decade drowning in quiet debt, that bank paper was a winning lottery ticket. They treated the funds as a divine reward for their superior breeding, and they immediately set about correcting their long-standing financial grievances with an alarming speed. By Wednesday afternoon, Sylvia had marched into the administrative office of the Tulsa Country Club, holding her head impossibly high. She settled 3 years of past due membership dues in a single sweeping transaction, slapping a certified check down on the polished mahogany desk. She did not stop there. She walked directly into the pro shop and purchased new, custom-fitted golf clubs for my father. She booked the Grand Ballroom for an upcoming weekend, putting down a staggering deposit for what she called a legacy celebration gala. She wanted the entire local elite to gather under crystal chandeliers to witness her triumph. Richard was equally reckless. He drove down to the luxury auto mall in the city and traded in his aging sedan. He returned to the ranch driving a pristine, heavy-duty truck with heated leather seats and a gleaming chrome grille. The vehicle was entirely impractical for actual agricultural work, but Richard never intended to haul anything heavier than a set of golf clubs. He parked it right on the front lawn, leaving it visible to anyone driving past the property line. They bought expensive silk gowns. They ordered imported wine by the case. They hired a landscaping crew to manicure the driveway, planting expensive, exotic shrubs that require endless watering in our arid climate. The sheer velocity of their spending was terrifying. They were burning through the escrow funds before a single architectural permit was approved, before the developer's environmental impact studies were completed, before the ink on the preliminary surface contract was even dry. The dramatic irony of the situation pressed down on me like a physical weight. I would sit in my small university office, watching the hours tick by on the wall clock, knowing exactly what was hidden in the glove box of my field truck. The heavy manila folder held the recorded deeds to the deep agricultural and water rights. I owned the subterranean covenants. By selling the property as a viable commercial site without disclosing the severed rights, my parents were not executing a brilliant real estate deal. They were committing a massive, verifiable case of corporate fraud. They were selling a product they did not legally possess. Every time Sylvia swiped a high-limit credit card to buy another designer handbag, she was marching one step closer to a catastrophic lawsuit. Every time Richard boasted to his golfing partners about the $10 million buyout, he was tightening the noose around his own neck. They were gleefully leaping off a financial cliff, convinced they had wings. I tried to focus on my research. I poured my energy into mapping the mycelial networks in my soil samples, checking the humidity levels in my incubators, running complex regression analyses on my laptop. I told myself their financial ruin was their own making. I had warned my sister about the water covenants. I had handed them a life raft, and they had slapped it out of my hands. I told myself to sit back and let gravity take its natural course. But the situation escalated far beyond abstract financial ruin on a Friday morning. I drove out to the ranch to collect a fresh batch of soil samples from the lower basin. As I turned my battered field truck onto the gravel access road, I saw them. 3 massive yellow bulldozers sat idling near the southern fence line. Heavy flatbed trucks loaded with steel surveying stakes and optical leveling equipment were parked along the grassy shoulder. A crew of men wearing neon reflective vests and hard hats were unrolling fixed spools of orange boundary tape directly across my designated ecological testing zones. The developers were not waiting for the final closing documents. Emboldened by the signed preliminary surface contract, they had dispatched their engineering teams to begin the initial site preparation. They were moving swiftly to map out the foundation grids for the mega data center. I parked my truck and walked toward the crew. The deep rumble of the diesel engines vibrated through the soles of my work boots. The smell of exhaust fumes hung heavy in the humid Oklahoma air. A foreman holding an electronic tablet looked up as I approached. "You cannot place those stakes here," I said, raising my voice slightly to be heard over the idling machinery. "This is active federal research land. These soil plots are under a strict isolation protocol." The foreman frowned, looking down at his digital map. He swiped his thumb across the screen, shaking his head. "Sorry, ma'am," he replied, his tone polite but dismissive. "We have direct authorization from the property owners. Richard Torres signed the access waivers yesterday afternoon. We are cleared to begin grading the southern perimeter to prepare for the concrete pour." I looked past him. The orange boundary tape cut directly through the center of my long-term drought resistance plots. I had spent 3 years cultivating those specific fungal colonies. If a bulldozer blade scraped off the top layer of that soil, the microscopic networks would be instantly pulverized. Years of meticulous federal research, the potential key to saving thousands of dying agricultural acres, would be erased in an afternoon, simply to make room for a paved parking lot. I felt a cold, sharp knot tighten in my stomach. The abstract danger of the fraudulent real estate deal had suddenly become a violent, physical threat to my life's work. I walked briskly back up the gravel road toward the main house. I found my parents on the wraparound porch. They were sitting in their imported patio furniture, sipping iced tea from tall glass tumblers. Richard was reading a glossy brochure for a luxury vacation resort. Sylvia was flipping through fabric swatches for the upcoming gala. "You gave the surveyors access to the lower basin," I stated, my voice clipped and tight. Richard looked up over the rim of his reading glasses. He sighed, folding the brochure and setting it down on the glass table. "Relax, Cora," he said, sounding profoundly bored. "They are just driving a few stakes into the ground. It is part of the pre-construction agreement Vanessa drafted. The developers want to move fast. We are accommodating our buyers. It is just good business." "Those are isolation plots," I countered, gripping the wooden porch railing. "They are actively mapping out a grading zone. If those machines rip up that soil, they will destroy 3 years of federal microbiology research. You cannot let them dig there." Sylvia let out a sharp, exasperated breath. She tossed the fabric swatches onto the table, glaring at me with raw, undisguised irritation. Honestly, Cora, you are being hysterical, she snapped. It is just dirt. The developers are paying us $10 million. We are not going to halt a historic commercial transaction because you are worried about some invisible mushrooms in the mud. You need to pack up your little hobby project and clear it out by Monday. The heavy equipment needs the space. She waved her manicured hand, brushing me away as if I were a minor nuisance, a fly buzzing around her expensive iced tea. She turned back to her fabric swatches, entirely unconcerned with the devastation she had just authorized. I stood on the porch looking at the two people who were supposed to protect me. They had spent my savings. They had mocked my education. And now, for the sake of a fraudulent check, they were casually ordering the destruction of my professional career. I walked back down the porch steps, listening to the distant mechanical growl of the bulldozers. The clock was ticking loudly. The developers were eager to break ground. My parents were eager to spend the rest of the escrow money. The momentum of the lie was accelerating rapidly, dragging my entire life toward the edge of the cliff. The heavy machinery was idling at the fence line, ready to tear through the earth. I knew I held the legal paperwork to stop them, but exposing the severed deeds meant detonating the $10 million deal, destroying my parents' financial fantasy, and triggering a catastrophic fraud lawsuit that would decimate the family name forever. Will I stay silent and let my life's work be paved over with concrete just to protect my parents' fragile egos from the truth? I left the ranch in a state of calculated detachment. The mechanical growl of the diesel engines faded as I steered my battered field truck onto the paved county highway, but the vibration still hummed in the bones of my arms. I did not drive to my small city apartment. I navigated straight to the university campus, parking in the subterranean concrete lot beneath the Environmental Sciences building. I needed the quiet, sterile environment of my laboratory to process the threat hanging over my life. The lab smelled of bleached countertops and damp nutrient agar. It was a stark contrast to the chaotic performative energy of my childhood home. For the past decade, this room had been my sanctuary. I had spent countless nights sitting on a hard metal stool, observing petri dishes under harsh fluorescent lighting while my peers were out socializing. I mapped the intricate survival mechanisms of native fungal colonies, documenting how they filtered toxins and retained moisture during severe droughts. It was tedious, unglamorous labor, but it resulted in a breakthrough that earned a proprietary federal patent registered strictly in my name. I set my canvas bag on the long stainless steel workbench and opened my laptop. I intended to draft an emergency cease and desist order to halt the grading crew. But before I could open a blank document, my eyes caught a red, urgent notification flashing at the top of my digital inbox. The sender was Director Thorne, the head of the Federal Agricultural Oversight Board in Washington. He was the bureaucrat who managed the disbursement of my institutional funding. He rarely reached out directly unless a critical compliance issue required immediate attention. I clicked the subject line. It read, "Priority review required. Horizon Technologies Infrastructure Partnership." Horizon Technologies was the Silicon Valley firm attempting to purchase my parents' ranch. I pulled my chair closer to the glowing monitor, the blue light casting long shadows across the silent laboratory. The email was lengthy, dense with legal terminology and bureaucratic acronyms. As I read through the paragraphs, the cold knot of anxiety in my stomach began to untangle, replaced by a sharp, striking clarity. The narrative I thought I understood was entirely wrong. Director Thorne explained that the Federal Environmental Protection Agency had recently enacted a sweeping set of restrictions targeting industrial water consumption in drought-stricken regions. Mega data centers were the primary target. These facilities house tens of thousands of high-capacity servers that generate staggering amounts of heat. To prevent hardware failure, the buildings require immense cooling systems that evaporate millions of gallons of water every single day. Under the new regulatory framework, tech companies could no longer pull that volume of liquid from native municipal grids or fragile deep aquifers without implementing a sustainable, closed-loop recycling system. Horizon had spent months searching for a biological filtration method that could purify their industrial runoff and return it to the local water table safely. They found exactly one viable solution. I scrolled down to the attached digital dossier. It was the preliminary environmental impact statement Horizon submitted to the Federal Zoning Commission. The document outlined their strategy for building a sustainable facility in the Midwest. On page 14, under the heading of Ecological Mitigation, I found a familiar scientific diagram. It was a schematic of a subsurface mycelial network designed to filter heavy metals and stabilize ground moisture. It was my diagram. Below the illustration, the corporate lawyers had typed a formal declaration. The text stated the proposed data center would utilize a proprietary biological filtration matrix to achieve strict federal compliance. The document named the registered patent holder, Dr. Cora Torres. I leaned back in my metal chair, the silence of the laboratory pressing against my ears. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The developers did not select the Torres acreage by random chance. They did not care about the highway access or the scenic perimeter. They targeted the property because my active pilot project was already thriving in that specific soil. The Silicon Valley executives were brilliant strategists. They had discovered my published research tracked the location of my field trials and dispatched their commercial acquisition team to secure the land. But large tech corporations operate in highly segmented divisions. The research and development wing in California understood the vital importance of the microbiology. The real estate acquisition wing, operating on the ground in Oklahoma, was simply tasked with buying the physical acreage. When my sister Vanessa walked into their regional office, offering to broker the sale of her family estate, the executives made a logical but fatal assumption. They saw the last name. They knew the biological asset was located on the property. They assumed the Torres family was a unified front, acting as a cohesive business entity to facilitate the federal partnership. They thought Vanessa was acting as my representative. They humored my sister's arrogant posturing and paid her inflated surface valuation because they believed securing the physical dirt was the required first step to securing my signature on a lucrative biological licensing agreement. They handed my parents a 7-figure escrow check under the false impression that I was a willing participant in the venture. The profound irony of the situation washed over me. Vanessa believed she was a real estate genius who had orchestrated a historic buyout through sheer charm and business acumen. My parents believed they were finally receiving the financial reward their superior breeding deserved. They had spent the entire week mocking my education and demanding I pack up my useless hobby to make room for their triumph. They had no idea their $10 million golden ticket was generated entirely by the daughter they treated like a servant. I looked back at the glowing screen. Director Thorne requested my immediate authorization to release the final phase of my patent schematics to the Horizon engineering team. He noted that the developers were eager to finalize the filtration protocols before pouring the concrete foundation. If I replied to the email and declined the partnership, Horizon would lose their federal compliance. The Environmental Protection Agency would deny the building permits. The mega data center would become an impossibility. The $10 million commercial transaction would evaporate into thin air, resulting in the immediate cancellation of the surface contract. I thought about the heavy yellow machinery idling near the southern fence line of the ranch. The survey crew was preparing to drive steel stakes through my isolation plots. My mother had callously ordered the destruction of the fungal colonies to accommodate the buyers. She was ordering the destruction of the exact biological asset the buyers came to purchase. The power dynamic of my entire existence shifted in the span of 10 minutes. I was no longer the helpless victim watching her life get paved over by arrogant relatives. I held the keys to the entire corporate transaction. The manila folder, sitting in the glove box of my truck, contained the deep subsurface rights preventing them from drilling for water. The federal patent registered in my name prevented them from securing the zoning permits. My family was sitting in a house of cards financed by a fraudulent check, preparing to throw a lavish country club gala to celebrate their victory. They were spending money they did not own for a deal they could not legally execute. The developers think the family is working with me. What will they do when they discover the family is actually at war with me? The afternoon sun beat down on the asphalt, baking the Oklahoma landscape into a brittle, cracked crust. I steered my field truck back onto the county highway, leaving the sterile safety of the university laboratory. Knowing the corporate reality of the Horizon acquisition changed the entire landscape of my problem. My immediate priority was no longer drafting legal documents. My priority was securing the biological assets. I needed to extract the primary fungal cultures from my ranch greenhouse before the developer grading crews accidentally destroyed the exact thing they were hired to acquire. I turned onto the familiar gravel driveway, bypassing the main house and heading straight for the southern perimeter. The greenhouse sat near the edge of the property line. It was a modest glass and steel structure, self-funded, and built to maintain strict climate control for my federal experiments. As I crested the small hill leading to the site, my foot slammed onto the brake pedal. The truck skidded, sending a cloud of white dust into the hot air. A sleek black catering van was parked horizontally across the loading zone. The heavy, reinforced thermal doors of my greenhouse were propped wide open, braced by decorative concrete planters. And sitting outside on the unforgiving, baking asphalt, directly under the punishing 100-degree sun, were my thermal incubators. I threw the truck into park and scrambled out, leaving the engine running. The heat radiating from the pavement was stifling. I ran toward the metal cabinets. The digital displays on the front panels were flashing frantic red warning codes. The internal temperatures had spiked past the survival threshold for delicate microbiology. Inside those units were 3 years of selective breeding, strains of drought-resistant mycelium that held the key to a federal patent and a multi-million-dollar corporate infrastructure deal were currently cooking in the summer heat. I pushed through the open doors of the greenhouse, and the air inside felt like a surreal alternate dimension. The long metal workbenches where I usually analyze soil samples were covered in crisp white linen tablecloths. Towers of crystal champagne flutes were stacked near the irrigation controls. At the center of the room stood Vanessa, holding a digital tablet pointing toward the ceiling, while a hired crew hung strings of fairy lights from my humidity sensors. Standing beside her was Bradley, her fiancé. Bradley was a junior vice president at a regional wealth management firm, a title his uncle created for him right out of college. He wore a pastel polo shirt and imported leather loafers without socks. He possessed the distinct, unearned confidence of a man who had never once faced a consequence for his own actions. He viewed the world entirely through the lens of superficial retail value. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice echoing off the glass panels. Vanessa did not even flinch. She looked up from her tablet, sighing, as if my presence was a minor scheduling error. "We are setting up the staging area for the engagement party," she said, waving her hand toward the crystal flutes. Mom booked the country club for the main gala next month, but Bradley and I wanted an intimate sunset cocktail hour out here on the ranch this weekend. The rustic aesthetic is very popular right now. We needed a place to prep the catering, and this dusty old shed was just sitting here empty. "It is not an empty shed, Vanessa," I said, stepping closer to the workbenches. "It is an active, climate-controlled laboratory. You unplugged the incubators. You pushed them out onto the asphalt." Bradley stepped forward, sliding his hands into the pockets of his tailored shorts. He flashed a bright, patronizing smirk. "Take it easy, Cora," he drawled, his tone dripping with condescension. "We just needed to clear out some counter space for the bartenders. Those bulky metal boxes were ruining the layout. Besides, it's just a bunch of dead dirt in there anyway. You can always dig up some more mud tomorrow." I looked at the man who was about to marry into my family. He was standing inside a structure funded by my labor, mocking the exact science that was currently financing his fiancé's fantasy real estate commission. He did not care about the damage. He enjoyed the power of the disruption. I did not scream. I did not throw the crystal champagne flutes onto the concrete floor. Hysteria is a chaotic release of energy, and I needed every ounce of my focus to salvage the surviving data. I turned my back on them and walked out of the greenhouse into the blinding sunlight. I lowered the tailgate of my truck and pulled out a heavy-duty insulated transport cooler. I carried it over to the baking incubators and opened the metal doors. The smell of hot plastic and scorched earth wafted out. Many of the petri dishes were ruined, the agar melted into useless liquid. But the primary culture tubes stored in the lower insulated racks were still viable. Their temperatures were dangerously high, but they had not yet crossed the fatal threshold. I worked with methodical precision. I transferred the surviving glass tubes into the portable cooler, securing them in the thermal foam. My hands did not shake. My breathing remained slow and steady. Vanessa strolled out of the greenhouse holding a clipboard, leaning against the doorframe. "You are lucky we did not just toss all that junk into the commercial dumpster," she remarked, watching me pack the vials. "You really need to clear your clutter off the property anyway, Cora. The developers are going to level this whole area by next week. You are standing in the way of progress." I closed the lid of the transport cooler and locked the heavy plastic latches. I lifted it into the bed of my truck, sliding it securely against the cab. I turned around and looked at my sister and her future husband. They were smiling. It was a small, shared look of triumph. They felt powerful because they had successfully displaced me. They did not just misunderstand the complex ecological science I dedicated my life to. They actively viewed my existence as trash, to be swept aside whenever it inconvenienced their aesthetic desires. My boundaries were invisible to them. My property was theirs to discard. For 34 years, I had tried to earn a baseline level of respect from my blood relatives by shrinking myself down, making my needs small, fixing their mistakes in the shadows. I thought if I absorbed enough of their cruelty, they would eventually recognize my value. Watching Bradley chuckle while Vanessa checked her makeup in the reflection of my greenhouse glass, the final frayed thread of my familial loyalty snapped. It was not a loud, dramatic break. It was a quiet, structural failure. You cannot negotiate with people who derive joy from destroying the things you love. You cannot reason with a parasite. You can only sever the host. I did not owe them a warning about the developer's true intentions. I did not owe them protection from the fraudulent transaction they were sprinting toward. I climbed into the driver's seat of my field truck and started the engine. I looked at them one last time through the dusty windshield. They were walking back into the greenhouse to arrange their crystal glasses, oblivious to the fact that they had just unplugged the only life support system keeping their $10 million fantasy alive. I shifted the truck into gear and drove away from the ranch. The biological assets were secure. The legal deeds were resting in my glove box. The trap was fully loaded, and the villains were eagerly pulling the tripwire. You cannot negotiate with people who enjoy destroying you. How will I strike back without losing my own dignity? I secured the surviving microbial cultures inside the university laboratory refrigerators shortly after midnight. The heavy hum of the commercial compressors provided a steady white noise washing over the sterile stainless steel counters. I had salvaged the biological foundation of the federal patent. The corporate leverage remained firmly in my possession. I sat on a rigid metal stool staring at the digital temperature gauges, evaluating the board like a chess player, plotting the final sequence of moves. I owed my family nothing. They had trampled my workspace, mocked my profession, and openly celebrated my marginalization. Yet a lingering thread of daughterly obligation tugged at the back of my mind. It was not born of affection, but of a strict adherence to my own ethical code. I am an engineer at heart. When you spot a catastrophic flaw in a structural blueprint, you do not walk away without notifying the site manager. You deliver the hazard report. What the manager does with that information is their own burden to bear. I decided to offer my father one final, factual life raft. The next morning, I drove back to the ranch. The property was eerily quiet. The catering vans had departed, leaving the trampled grass near the greenhouse as the only physical evidence of my sister's engagement preparations. The heavy yellow earth movers sat silent near the southern perimeter, waiting for the grading permits to clear. I found Richard in his private study on the ground floor of the main house. The room was a masterclass in performative intellect. The dark mahogany bookshelves were lined with leather-bound classic literature he had never opened. The walls featured framed photographs of him, shaking hands with local politicians, and holding shiny golf trophies. It was the curated sanctuary of a man who desperately wanted to be perceived as a powerful patriarch, but lacked the fundamental courage to actually lead. He was sitting behind his oversized desk holding a gold-plated pen, reviewing the monthly statements for the escrow account. He looked relaxed, his shoulders dropped, his face flushed with the easy comfort of unearned wealth. I stepped through the open doorway. My boots made a soft thud on the woven Persian rug. He glanced up, his expression shifting into a familiar mask of mild annoyance. "If you are here to complain about the caterers moving your science fair projects, Cora," he sighed, setting the pen down, "I really do not have the bandwidth today. Your sister is under a lot of stress planning this transaction, and you need to be a team player." I remained standing. I did not cross the threshold any further. I kept my voice stripped of all emotion, delivering the data with the same clinical precision I used to present findings to my Federal Oversight Committee. "I am not here to talk about the greenhouse," I stated. "I am here to talk about the load-bearing math of your real estate deal." Vanessa utilized a junior paralegal for the title sweep. They only reviewed the surface register. They never pulled the subterranean archive. Richard frowned, picking up a heavy crystal paperweight and turning it over in his hands. "You are speaking in riddles. The title is clear. The deposit cleared the wire transfer. We are closing the sale next week." "You are not closing anything," I corrected. 5 years ago, when this ranch was 72 hours from a county tax foreclosure, I utilized my personal savings and a federal grant to clear your default. In exchange, I executed a legal severance. I own the deep agricultural rights, the mineral rights, and the subsurface water covenants. My name is on the recorded deeds. You and Sylvia only own the topsoil. The crystal paperweight slipped from his fingers, hitting the leather desk blotter with a dull thud. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a pale, sickly gray. He blinked rapidly, his mind struggling to process a truth he had spent half a decade pretending did not exist. He knew I paid the bank, but he had insulated himself with the lie that it was a simple familial loan, a quiet favor he could ignore. Facing the reality of the legal severance meant facing his own profound failure as a provider. I did not give him time to construct a new defense mechanism. I pressed forward, laying out the rest of the blueprint. Furthermore, the Silicon Valley developers are not acquiring this property for the highway access, I continued. Horizon Technologies is under a strict mandate from the Environmental Protection Agency. They cannot construct a mega data center without a sustainable, closed-loop water recycling system. That specific system requires a proprietary, drought-resistant fungal matrix. I hold the registered federal patent for that exact matrix. Richard stared at me, his mouth slightly open, his breath turning shallow. Horizon believes Vanessa represents a unified family trust, I explained. They believe acquiring the surface dirt is the first step toward securing my signature on a biological licensing agreement. When their corporate attorneys finalize the deep title audit, they will discover the severance. When they realize I am not a willing participant in this transaction, they will rescind the offer. I took a slow breath, letting the silence fill the room before delivering the final hazard report. If you continue to spend that escrow deposit while signing preliminary closing documents for assets you do not legally possess, you are committing wire fraud. You are committing commercial real estate fraud. Horizon will sue you for damages. They will seize the surface deed in civil court and they will bankrupt you. You need to halt the spending and return the deposit today. For 10 agonizing seconds, the room was perfectly still. I watched the internal gears turning behind my father's eyes. I saw the raw terror register. He understood the math. He recognized the impending legal disaster. He knew I was telling the truth. But then a different kind of fear washed over him. I watched his gaze drift past me toward the hallway leading to the grand dining room, where Sylvia was currently browsing through expensive catering menus for her upcoming victory gala. Richard was terrified of federal lawsuits, but he was paralyzed by the thought of his wife's wrath. Admitting the transaction was a sham meant walking into the next room and telling Sylvia she was not rich. It meant telling Vanessa her real estate career was built on a humiliating error. It meant destroying the glossy country club facade he had sacrificed his own dignity to maintain. He could not do it. His cowardice won. The pale gray terror on his face dissolved, hardening into a brittle, patronizing smile. He stood up from his heavy leather chair, walking around the edge of the mahogany desk. He approached me, reaching out to pat my shoulder with a heavy, condescending hand. "Cora, Cora, Cora," he chuckled, his voice vibrating with a forced, artificial warmth. "You are letting your imagination run wild. You spend too much time alone in that dark room looking through microscopes. It makes you paranoid." I looked down at his hand resting on my shoulder and then back up to his eyes. "This is commercial business, sweetheart," he continued, squeezing my arm slightly. "It is complicated. It involves high-level corporate strategy you simply do not understand. Vanessa is a trained professional. The developers have top-tier lawyers. Everything is perfectly legal and moving forward exactly as planned." He removed his hand and shoved it into his tailored trouser pocket, puffing out his chest. "I appreciate your concern," he said, his tone shifting to a dismissive parental cadence. "But you need to leave the grown-up math to the adults. Go back to your useless little lab and focus on your science projects. We have everything under control here." He willfully chose the illusion. He looked at a verified structural collapse and decided to simply paint over the cracks. I did not argue. I did not present the printed emails from my grant director or the copies of the severed deeds. Providing physical evidence to a man committed to his own delusion is a waste of vital energy. I had fulfilled my ethical obligation. The hazard report was delivered and explicitly rejected. My conscience was permanently clear. "I understand," I replied, my voice dropping to a cool, flat whisper. I turned around and walked out of the study, leaving him standing in his curated sanctuary of fake literature and hollow trophies. I walked out the heavy front doors, stepping into the sweltering Oklahoma heat. I climbed into my truck and drove away from the Torres estate, knowing I would never return to save them again. The final warning has been rejected. How catastrophic will the crash be now that the brakes are cut? A full week evaporated into the humid summer air. Following my final conversation with Richard, I severed all physical contact with the estate. I retreated into the clinical sanctuary of my university workspace. Through the quiet grapevine of local vendors and county clerks, I heard the rumors of the Torres family's spending spree. The caterers were securing imported seafood. The florists were importing rare orchids that would wilt in the harsh climate within hours. The Tulsa Country Club was bracing for the most extravagant social event of the season. The escrow deposit was vanishing into thin air, funding an illusion that was legally doomed to shatter. On Thursday afternoon, my cellular phone vibrated on the stainless steel counter. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I let it vibrate 3 times, watching the device inch across the polished metal surface before I finally pressed the green acceptance icon. I did not offer a warm greeting. I simply raised the receiver to my ear and waited. Sylvia did not bother with pleasantries. Her voice was clipped, rigid, vibrating with the frantic energy of a field general orchestrating a military campaign. "You are expected at the Grand Ballroom this Saturday evening at 7 o'clock sharp," she dictated. "Do not be late, Cora. The Horizon executives are flying in from California, and we are hosting a formal dinner to celebrate Vanessa's triumph." I sat on my hard metal stool, looking at a row of glass petri dishes. I asked her why my presence was required. I reminded her that my scientific hobbies were considered an embarrassment to the family brand. Her sigh crackled through the small speaker, a sharp hiss of pure annoyance. "Do not start with your victim routine tonight," she snapped. "You are attending because it would look highly suspicious to the buyers if the older sister boycotted the milestone. We need to present a cohesive, polished front. This is a historic commercial transaction, and the investors expect a picture-perfect family aesthetic." She paused, letting the weight of her authority settle over the digital connection. Then she delivered the specific conditions of my attendance. "You will wear something muted," she instructed, her tone dropping into a low, patronizing cadence. "Navy blue or a simple black dress, nothing that draws the eye. Ensure your shoes are clean. I do not want you tracking field mud onto the ballroom carpet. When the investors speak to you, keep your answers brief. Do not launch into a boring lecture about your fungi or your worms. Just smile, nod, and let Vanessa steer the conversation. She is the star of the evening. Your only job is to blend into the background and not embarrass us. She terminated the call before I could utter a single syllable in response. The line went dead, leaving a flat, hollow silence in my ear. I lowered the phone and stared at the blank screen. Any residual guilt I harbored about remaining quiet vanished in that precise moment. My mother did not invite me to share in the joy of a familial success. She issued a coercive subpoena. She needed a prop. She required a drab, unaccomplished background extra to stand in the shadows so her golden child could shine even brighter under the crystal chandeliers. But my analytical mind recognized a deeper, more insidious layer to her demand. Presenting a cohesive front to the Horizon executives was a calculated strategic maneuver. Sylvia and Richard knew the buyers were eager to close the deal. They also knew I was the unpredictable variable. Placing me in a room filled with 200 wealthy socialites and high-powered corporate investors was not just about aesthetics. It was a pressure cooker. I realized this was not a celebratory party. It was a staged, public execution. They intended to use the immense weight of the crowd to force me into silent compliance. They believed that if they cornered me in a formal setting, wearing an expensive dress, surrounded by the regional elite, I would lack the courage to cause a disruption. They assumed my lifelong habit of retreating into the shadows meant I would automatically fold under the intense glare of the spotlight. They were banking on my fear of public humiliation. They did not understand that a person who has spent her entire life being humiliated in private no longer fears the judgment of strangers. I stood up from my stool and walked out of the laboratory. I navigated the echoing concrete corridors of the science building, taking the stairwell down to the subterranean parking garage. The air was thick, smelling of motor oil and damp concrete. I approached my battered field truck and unlocked the passenger side door. I climbed inside and reached across the worn upholstery. I pressed the small black button on the dashboard. The glove box dropped open with a sharp mechanical click. Resting beneath a stack of old tire receipts and vehicle registration manuals was the plain manila folder. I pulled it out, letting my fingers trace the heavy paper edges. Inside this unassuming envelope rested the recorded deeds to the deep agricultural and subsurface water rights. It also contained the printed email threads from Director Thorne, confirming the federal environmental mandate and the proprietary biological licensing requirements. It was the undeniable, documented truth, printed in black ink and stamped by the county clerk. I carried the folder back to my small apartment on the north side of the city. I walked into my bedroom and opened the closet door. I bypassed my sturdy canvas work clothes and reached for a sleek, unassuming black leather handbag. It was a structured professional purse, one I rarely used. I opened the brass clasp and slid the manila folder inside. It fit perfectly. I set the black purse on the small wooden table near my front door. I looked at it for a long time. The physical sensation of holding that legal power altered my internal chemistry. The erratic heartbeat of a victimized daughter faded away entirely, replaced by the slow, rhythmic pulse of a structural engineer. When an engineer is hired to oversee the demolition of a condemned high-rise, they do not feel sorrow for the collapsing concrete. They do not mourn the shattering glass. They simply review their calculations, check the safety perimeter, and wait for the gravitational pull to execute the math. My parents had built a towering skyscraper out of deceit, arrogance, and a stolen 7-figure deposit. They had ignored every warning sign. They had actively sabotaged the foundation. Now they were inviting the entire city to stand inside the lobby and applaud their architectural genius. I felt a profound, striking calm wash over my body. It was a cold, detached tranquility. I was no longer the scapegoat shrinking away from the cruelty of her own blood. I was the inspector, holding the final hazard report. I would put on the muted black dress. I would ensure there was no mud on my shoes. I would attend the grand gala exactly as instructed. I would sit in the background and watch the structure fall. The stage is set. The wealthy audience is arriving. But who is actually directing the play? The tires of my battered field truck crunched against the pristine white gravel of the Tulsa Country Club's circular driveway. A young valet attendant wearing a crisp uniform stepped forward, his expression faltering for a fraction of a second as he took in the rusted fender and the dusty windshield. I handed in the keys, stepping out into the warm evening air. I wore a simple, structured navy blue dress, meeting my mother's strict aesthetic requirements. My shoes were clean, polished, devoid of any laboratory mud. Suspended from my shoulder was the unassuming black leather purse. The heavy oak double doors of the clubhouse opened, revealing a sensory overload of manufactured wealth. The grand ballroom was a cavernous space, bathed in the warm amber glow of three-tiered crystal chandeliers. 200 guests filled the room, generating a low, constant hum of orchestrated networking. I stood near the entryway, analyzing the crowd. The division of power was easy to spot. The local Tulsa elite wore heavy silk gowns and tailored tuxedo jackets, holding their crystal champagne flutes with practiced ease. Woven through the crowd were the Horizon Technologies executives. They stood out in their sleek minimalist suits, sans ties, projecting the casual, polished authority of California tech capital. They were the architects of the $10 million buyout, mingling with the locals who viewed them as visiting royalty. I approached the gold-embossed seating chart displayed on an ornate wooden easel. I scanned the alphabetical list, tracing my finger down the heavy cardstock. My parents and Vanessa were seated at table 1, located in the dead center of the room, directly beneath the largest chandelier. The Horizon executives were anchored at Table 2 and Table 3, forming a tight nucleus of power and prestige. I found my name, Table 24. I turned and navigated through the sea of expensive perfume and tailored fabric. I walked past the prime real estate, moving toward the outer perimeter of the ballroom. The tables grew less ornate the further back I traveled. The elaborate floral centerpieces shrank in size. The ambient light grew noticeably dimmer. I reached the very back corner of the room. Table 24 sat in the shadows, positioned mere inches from the heavy, swinging wooden doors that led directly into the industrial catering kitchen. The table lacked a floral arrangement entirely. There were no other formal guests seated around the circular linen. My dining companions were 3 off-duty busboys and a junior event coordinator holding a digital headset. This was the designated overflow zone, the hidden corner where the hired help took their mandatory breaks to drink ice water before returning to the floor. My designated seat was not a plush upholstered dining chair. It was a standard metal folding chair dragged out of a storage closet to accommodate an unwanted extra body. The visual insult was staggering in its precision. Sylvia had not merely placed me at the back of the room. She had actively downgraded my physical status, assigning me to a tier below the invited guests. By placing me next to the swinging kitchen doors, she ensured my view of the head table was constantly interrupted by waiters rushing past with heavy trays of prime rib. She engineered the layout to communicate my exact value to the family hierarchy. I pulled out the cold metal chair and sat down. The junior event coordinator gave me a polite, confused nod before whispering into her headset. I ordered a glass of sparkling water from a passing waiter. I placed the black leather purse squarely on my lap, resting my palms flat against the smooth material. I did not feel a single pang of sorrow. The sting of rejection requires a baseline expectation of love, and I had abandoned that expectation years ago. Instead, I observed the room with the cool detachment of a building inspector surveying a doomed property. Across the ballroom, I watched Sylvia working the crowd. She glided between tables, holding her champagne flute, holding court with the wives of local politicians. Richard trailed a few steps behind her, nodding enthusiastically at whatever she said, his face flushed with the glow of expensive bourbon. Vanessa was the true focal point. She wore a shimmering silver gown that caught the chandelier light with every step. She stood near the Horizon executives, laughing brightly, leaning in to touch the arm of a senior developer. She radiated the smug, unearned confidence of a woman who believed she had conquered the commercial real estate world. At one point, the lead tech developer, a tall man with silver hair and wire-rimmed glasses, gestured toward the back of the room. He seemed to be asking a question, scanning the perimeter. Horizon was acquiring the dirt to secure my biological patent. It was highly probable the executive was asking to meet Dr. Torres, the federal scientist whose research was the linchpin of their entire sustainable infrastructure plan. I watched Sylvia intercept his gaze. Her maternal radar detected the threat instantly. She practically materialized beside the executive, placing a guiding hand on his elbow and steering his shoulders back toward the center of the room. She signaled Vanessa with a sharp tilt of her chin. My sister moved swiftly, stepping directly into the executive's line of sight. Vanessa and Sylvia formed a physical, human barricade, utilizing their shimmering gowns and loud, rehearsed laughter to block the developer from looking toward the kitchen doors. They monopolized his attention, burying him in an avalanche of superficial charm, ensuring he never saw the woman sitting in the shadows. They were hiding the patent holder from the buyers. They believed keeping me concealed would preserve the illusion long enough to finalize the paperwork. I took a slow sip of my sparkling water, feeling the carbonation pop against my tongue. The wooden kitchen doors swung open behind me, releasing a rush of hot air and the sharp scent of roasted garlic. A waiter bumped the back of my metal chair, offering a hurried apology before vanishing into the crowd. The physical discomfort of the folding chair, the dim lighting, the deliberate isolation, none of it mattered. In structural engineering, there is a concept known as a stress test. You apply maximum pressure to a specific point to see how much weight the foundation can bear before it fractures. My family was applying maximum social pressure, assuming my spine would snap. They assumed I would remain silent rather than cause a scene in front of the Tulsa elite. They did not know my purse contained the equivalent of a wrecking ball. The dinner service slowly drew to a close. The waiters cleared the fine china plates, carrying them through the swinging doors behind my back. The ambient chatter in the cavernous room began to drop in volume. The overhead chandeliers dimmed, casting a focused, theatrical spotlight directly onto the head table. A man holding a digital clipboard approached the front of the room, tapping a microphone to test the audio feed. The sharp, rhythmic thud echoed through the speaker system, signaling the transition from the meal to the formal presentations. The orchestrated portion of the evening was beginning. I felt the leather of my purse warm beneath my fingertips. The intricate lie my parents constructed was about to be laid bare under the bright lights. The escrow money was spent. The bulldozers were idling. The buyers were sitting mere feet away, expecting a unified family partnership that did not exist. The humiliation is public and suffocating. When will the microphone turn on, and how will the trap be sprung? The sharp tap on the microphone brought the grand ballroom to a complete standstill. 200 guests shifted their attention to the center of the room. The event coordinator lowered his clipboard, stepping away to allow Vanessa to take the floor. She glided into the spotlight, her silver gown catching the illumination, throwing fractured reflections across the faces of the Horizon developers seated in the front row. She gripped the microphone stand with both hands, projecting the image of a seasoned corporate leader. She did not look nervous. She looked hungry. This was the moment she had chased her entire adult life, the ultimate validation of her superiority, broadcast directly to the wealthiest citizens in the county. Thank you all for being here tonight. Vanessa began, her voice echoing through the heavy speaker system, perfectly modulated and smooth. We are standing on the precipice of a historic transformation. For generations, the Torres Ranch has been a symbol of Oklahoma heritage. But heritage cannot remain stagnant. It must evolve. She paused, scanning the room, making deliberate eye contact with the lead tech executive. When Horizon Technologies first approached the region looking for a home for their new data center, I knew immediately that our property was the only logical choice. She continued, brokering this $10 million transaction was not just a commercial real estate victory for my firm. It was a personal mission to secure my family legacy and drag this state into the modern era. The local politicians in the audience nodded in solemn agreement, murmuring their approval. The tech developers clapped politely. I sat in the shadows on my metal folding chair, analyzing the sheer density of her delusion. She spoke as if she had personally mapped the zoning grids, conducted the soil diagnostics, and secured the federal permits. She claimed ownership of an ecological breakthrough she could not even pronounce. She continued her speech, weaving a narrative of her own relentless work ethic and brilliant negotiating tactics. She spoke for 5 solid minutes without once mentioning the biological filtration requirements, the water recycling mandate, or the proprietary federal patent holding the entire deal together. To Vanessa, the dirt was just a blank canvas, waiting for her to paint a masterpiece. Then her tone shifted. The polished professional cadence dropped, replaced by a familiar sharp edge. She decided the glowing self-praise was not enough. To truly cement her status as the savior of the Torres dynasty, she needed to establish a contrast. She needed a baseline failure to elevate her own success. She lifted her hand from the microphone stand and pointed directly toward the swinging kitchen doors at the back of the room. The theatrical spotlight did not reach my table, but 200 heads turned following the trajectory of her manicured finger. You know, building the future requires a certain kind of vision, Vanessa said, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. It requires grit and business acumen. It is not exactly a skill set everyone in my family shares. A low ripple of anticipatory silence moved through the crowd. Sylvia leaned forward in her chair at the head table, her eyes shining with dark delight. Take my older sister, for example, Vanessa announced, her voice amplifying over the speaker system. While I spent my 20s grinding in commercial real estate offices, securing contracts and building actual wealth, my sister spent her youth playing in the mud, earning a useless degree so she could talk to worms in a greenhouse. The insult landed exactly as intended. A wave of laughter rolled through the ballroom. It was not a warm, familial chuckle. It was the sharp, relieved laughter of wealthy people who enjoy watching a hierarchy being enforced. The local socialites giggled behind their champagne flutes. The politicians smiled. I looked toward the head table. My father Richard raised his hand to his face, covering his mouth, to stifle his own laughter, actively participating in the public humiliation of his firstborn child. Sylvia did not even try to hide her amusement. She beamed, radiating sheer pride, watching her golden child execute the perfect character assassination. I did not flinch. I did not avert my gaze. I did not feel the familiar hot sting of shame that used to flood my system when they mocked me in private. Public humiliation only works if the target values the opinion of the audience. The people laughing in this ballroom were applauding a fraudulent real estate broker and a coward who secretly bankrupted his own legacy. Their judgment held zero structural weight. I lowered my eyes from the stage and looked down at my left wrist. The face of my digital watch glowed faintly in the dim lighting. The red numbers shifted. 7:58. The National Financial News Cycle was scheduled to broadcast the federal infrastructure update at the top of the hour. Director Thorne had sent me the press embargo schedule 2 days prior. The Federal Environmental Protection Agency and Horizon Technologies had coordinated a joint media release to announce their $50 million Midwest Sustainability Initiative. The media release heavily featured the proprietary biological patent making the entire project possible. I knew the bartender stationed directly behind the head table kept the large mounted televisions tuned to that specific financial network. The screens were currently muted, displaying silent commercials for mutual funds and luxury vehicles. Vanessa waited for the laughter to die down before pulling the microphone close to her mouth for her final concluding remark. "So here is to the real world," she proclaimed, raising an invisible glass to the crowd. "Here is to the people who build things that actually matter. And here is to the future of the Torres estate." The ballroom erupted into enthusiastic applause. The guests set their drinks down to clap, clapping for a future that was mathematically impossible to construct. Vanessa took a slight theatrical bow, drinking in the adulation. I kept my hand resting squarely on the black leather purse sitting on my lap. The manila folder inside felt dense, heavy with the recorded deeds and the federal emails. The public assassination was complete. They had reduced my entire existence to a punchline in front of the most powerful people in the state. They had established their narrative, sealing my role as the useless older sister. The digital numbers on my watch shifted again. 7:59. The applause began to taper off, transitioning back into the low hum of conversational chatter. The event coordinator stepped forward to reclaim the microphone, preparing to transition the room into the next phase of the evening. But Sylvia was not finished. The orchestrated cruelty required a final, interactive component. She stood up from the head table, smoothing the front of her expensive silk gown, waving her hands to quiet the crowd. She walked over to Vanessa, taking the microphone, taking control of the stage. The trap was fully loaded, and my mother was eager to pull the tripwire. She was about to demand the physical surrender of my property, using the momentum of the laughing crowd to force my signature onto a blank piece of legal paper. I looked past my mother, staring directly at the dark glass of the muted televisions mounted above the bar. The public assassination is complete. But what is waiting in the shadows of the 8 o'clock hour? Sylvia gripped the microphone, tapping it once more to ensure she commanded the absolute attention of the room. The lingering chuckles from Vanessa's insult faded into a hushed, expectant silence. The crystal chandeliers seemed to burn brighter, casting sharp shadows across the white linen tables. My mother was standing at the absolute pinnacle of her perceived power. She had spent a decade treating her family like a stage production, and she was about to deliver the grand finale. "Thank you, Vanessa," my mother said, her voice projecting a cloying artificial sweetness that coated the ballroom like syrup. "Your words were truly inspiring, but tonight is not just about celebrating the future. It is about closing the chapters of the past." She paused, letting the dramatic weight of her statement settle over the wealthy guests. She looked toward the Horizon developers in the front row, flashing them a brilliant, reassuring smile. We all know that a $10 million commercial transaction requires a perfectly clean slate. Sylvia continued pacing slowly across the small stage area. No loose ends, no lingering, messy details. And because this family operates as a unified, loving partnership, we have arranged a touching little surprise to ensure the Horizon deal moves forward without a single hitch. She turned her gaze away from the developers and aimed it directly at the back corner of the room. 200 heads swiveled in unison. 400 eyes locked onto the woman sitting alone in the shadows on a metal folding chair. As you all know, Sylvia announced, her voice rising in volume to ensure it reached the kitchen doors. My oldest daughter, Cora, holds a tiny little agricultural lease on a fraction of our lower pastures for her science hobbies. But Cora understands that progress cannot be halted for a few patches of mud. The lie was breathtaking in its brazenness. She stood in front of the regional elite and reduced my legal ownership of the deep environmental rights to a temporary hobby lease. She was utilizing the ignorance of the crowd to overwrite the county property register in real time. So tonight, as a gesture of profound gratitude to her younger sister Sylvia, proclaimed, her smile widening into a rigid, terrifying mask, Cora is going to officially release her little lease. She is going to sign a quitclaim deed right here, right now, in front of all our esteemed guests to guarantee Vanessa's historic transaction is perfectly secure. The ambush was meticulously coordinated. The moment the words left her mouth, a junior event coordinator materialized from the kitchen hallway. She walked purposefully toward my table, holding a silver tray. Resting on the polished metal surface was a heavy sheet of legal stock paper and a sleek silver fountain pen. The coordinator reached my table and placed the tray directly in front of me, next to my glass of sparkling water. She stepped back, folding her hands in front of her, waiting. The printed document was a standard Oklahoma quitclaim deed. I read the bold black text at the top of the page. It was drafted to completely surrender any and all claims, covenants, and subsurface rights tied to the Torres estate, relinquishing them entirely to the surface owners. It was blank at the bottom, waiting for my signature to make the $10 million fraud a legitimate reality. The pressure in the ballroom instantly multiplied, becoming a tangible, heavy force pressing against my chest. The trap was executed flawlessly. If I signed the paper, I surrendered the biological assets, the federal mandate, and my life savings to fund my parents' vanity. If I refused to sign, I instantly became the bitter, jealous older sister, sabotaging her siblings' monumental success out of pure spite. A low murmur rippled through the audience. They were wealthy people who understood the mechanics of power. They recognized a public strong-arm tactic when they saw one. But they were socially conditioned to side with the charming hostess throwing the expensive party. They expected compliance. Cora Sweetheart Sylvia coaxed over the speaker system, her voice dripping with a menacing maternal warmth. "Just sign the paper. Let us not embarrass Vanessa tonight. It is just your little dirt project." I looked at the silver pen resting on the tray. It caught the dim light from the hallway glowing against the crisp, white paper. I could feel the collective gaze of the room burning into the side of my face. I saw the lead Horizon developer leaning forward in his chair, his brow furrowing slightly, watching the interaction with a sudden, sharp intensity. He was a corporate engineer witnessing an anomaly in the data. He was beginning to realize the family partnership was an illusion. I did not reach for the pen. I kept my hands resting squarely on my black leather purse. I looked across the vast expanse of the ballroom, staring directly into my mother's eyes. She maintained the rigid smile, but the muscles in her neck tightened. Her eyes darted toward the pen and back to my face, silently demanding my submission. Richard was sitting frozen at the head table, his knuckles white as he gripped his empty bourbon glass, terrified the entire facade was about to shatter. I took a slow, quiet breath. The structural integrity of their lie was stretched to its maximum load-bearing capacity. The foundation was hollow, the supports were rusted, and the heavy machinery of the truth was idling right outside the door. I looked away from my mother and shifted my gaze upward, toward the mahogany bar directly behind her. The digital clock on my wrist silently ticked over. 8 o'clock. The bartender, standing behind the polished mahogany, had been drying a crystal glass with a white towel. He glanced up at the large mounted televisions. The silent commercials for mutual funds abruptly vanished. The screen cut to the sleek blue and silver anchor desk of the National Financial News Network. The bartender reached beneath the counter, adjusting the audio dials for the ambient room speakers. He did not realize the gravity of what he was doing. He simply thought the wealthy investors in the room would want to hear the top-of-the-hour market updates. The low ambient music playing through the ballroom speakers suddenly cut out, replaced by the crisp, authoritative voice of the national news anchor. We interrupt our regular market programming for a breaking infrastructure update out of the Midwest. The anchor announced, his voice booming through the silent room, overriding Sylvia's microphone. Sylvia jumped, startled by the sudden influx of audio. She turned around, looking up at the massive screens. Vanessa spun around, her silver gown swishing loudly. The Horizon developers in the front row snapped their attention toward the bar. The ticker tape at the bottom of the television screens vanished. A bold, bright red banner flashed across the monitors, dominating the visual space. Tech giant abandons data centers for $50 million drought-resilient agriculture initiative. The room gasped. It was a collective, sharp intake of breath. 200 people read the headline simultaneously. The $10 million data center, the exact project Vanessa had just spent 10 minutes bragging about securing, was national news because it was being formally abandoned. But the headline was not the killing blow. The news anchor continued reading the teleprompter. Horizon Technologies confirmed today they are halting traditional data construction in favor of a massive federal partnership relying entirely on a proprietary biological filtration patent. The screen transitioned away from the anchor desk. A high-resolution photograph filled the monitors. It was a professional portrait taken by the University Press Office 3 years ago. The subject was wearing a white laboratory coat, standing in front of a climate-controlled greenhouse, holding a soil sample. It was my face. The anchor spoke my name, projecting it through the country club speakers with absolute clarity. The Environmental Protection Agency has awarded the primary oversight contract to the patent holder, Dr. Cora Torres, an Oklahoma-based soil microbiologist whose research is the cornerstone of this historic $50 million initiative. The ballroom descended into a profound graveyard silence. The clinking of glasses ceased. The whispered conversations evaporated. The only sound in the cavernous space was the echo of my name bouncing off the crystal chandeliers. The lead Horizon developer stood up from his chair at table 2. He ignored Sylvia. He ignored Vanessa. He turned his back on the head table and looked directly across the room, staring at the woman sitting in the shadows next to the kitchen doors. The pen is on the table. The audience is holding its breath. The universe has delivered the undeniable truth. How will the final strike be executed? The news anchor on the television screen did not stop speaking. His crisp, authoritative cadence continued to fill the cavernous ballroom, echoing off the crystal chandeliers and sinking deep into the imported carpet. He outlined the precise details of the $50 million federal initiative. He explained how the Environmental Protection Agency had designated the native Oklahoma soil as a critical testing zone. He read a direct quote from the Horizon Technologies Board of Directors, praising the groundbreaking biological filtration matrix developed exclusively by Dr. Cora Torres. Every single syllable dismantled another brick in the elaborate fortress my family had constructed. The anchor detailed how traditional data center construction was no longer viable in the region due to the severe ongoing drought. He stated that any future commercial development relied entirely upon the integration of the patented mycelial network to recycle industrial cooling water. The math was broadcast to the entire room in undeniable terms. The $10 million surface deal Vanessa had spent the evening boasting about was nothing more than a minor logistical footnote. It was a preliminary stepping stone required to access the true prize. The actual value, the staggering wealth and corporate prestige driving the entire transaction, belonged exclusively to the quiet woman sitting in the back corner on a metal folding chair. Sylvia was the first to break the paralysis. The rigid, performative smile that had defined her social existence for decades finally fractured. Her face contorted into a mask of raw, unfiltered panic. She spun around, waving her arms frantically at the bartender standing behind the polished mahogany counter. "Turn it off," she hissed, her voice cracking, lacking the polished syrup she utilized moments before. "Change the channel immediately. Turn that monitor off right now." The bartender fumbled with the digital remote control, his hands shaking under the sudden, intense scrutiny of 200 wealthy guests. He pressed the power button, but the television did not go dark. Instead, the audio spiked higher for a brief, agonizing second before the screen finally faded to black. The sudden absence of the broadcast left a ringing silence in the ballroom, but the damage was already permanent. You cannot unring a bell. You cannot unread a national headline. The truth had permeated the room, altering the social hierarchy with the speed of a chemical reaction. Vanessa stood in the center of the stage, her shimmering silver gown suddenly looking less like a symbol of triumph and more like a cheap costume. The smug confidence had drained from her features, leaving behind the terrified expression of a child caught in a lie. She clutched the microphone stand, her knuckles turning white. She looked desperately toward the front row where the Horizon executives were seated. "This is just a misunderstanding," Vanessa stammered, her voice thin and reedy, amplifying awkwardly over the speaker system. "The federal partnership is just a supplementary component. The surface acquisition is still the primary commercial objective. My brokerage firm is handling all the necessary integrations. We are a unified family team." Nobody in the crowd laughed this time. The local politicians who had nodded in solemn agreement 5 minutes prior now stared at her with cold, analytical detachment. They were people who survived in high society by aligning themselves with true power, and they recognized a sinking ship when they saw one. The lead tech developer, a senior engineer named Marcus Sterling, did not sit back down. He remained standing, his posture rigid, his eyes narrowing behind his wire-rimmed glasses. He was a man who dealt in complex structural logic, and the data points were rapidly aligning in his mind. He looked at Vanessa standing on the stage, trembling and grasping for control. He looked at Sylvia hyperventilating near the bar, her carefully curated aesthetic in ruins. He looked at Richard, sitting frozen at the head table, refusing to make eye contact with anyone in the room. Then Marcus Sterling turned his gaze back to me. He looked past the wealthy socialites, past the abandoned dinner plates, and focused entirely on the small table near the kitchen doors. His eyes drifted down to the silver tray resting on the linen tablecloth directly in front of me. He saw the blank quitclaim deed. He saw the silver fountain pen waiting to be uncapped. The realization hit him with visible force. His shoulders stiffened. The subtle, polite smile he had maintained all evening vanished, instantly replaced by a deep corporate fury. He understood the ambush. He realized Horizon Technologies had been manipulated. The regional executives had assumed the Torres family was acting as a cohesive unit to facilitate the federal biological partnership. They had issued a 7-figure escrow deposit under the strict assumption that Vanessa was representing my interests. Seeing the blank legal document presented to me in the middle of a crowded room, accompanied by a coercive public demand Marcus Sterling, grasped the chilling reality of the situation. The family was not working with the patent holder. The family was actively attempting to extort the patent holder. They were trying to steal the deep environmental rights using the pressure of a country club gala to force my signature. If I had signed that piece of paper, Horizon would have been legally entangled in a massive coercion and fraud scandal. Their $50 million federal initiative would have been compromised by a toxic family dispute. Vanessa and Sylvia had nearly destroyed a historic corporate expansion just to fund their own vanity. Marcus Sterling took a slow, deliberate step away from the stage. He did not say a word to Vanessa. He simply shook his head, a tight, controlled motion conveying profound professional disgust. He reached into his suit jacket, pulling out his cellular phone, preparing to contact his legal department. The audience watched the silent interaction, and the whisper network activated. The low murmur began at the tables nearest the developers and spread outward, rippling through the ballroom like a wave. The local elite were piecing the narrative together. They realized they had just spent the entire evening applauding a fraudulent real estate broker and laughing at the woman holding a multi-million-dollar federal contract. The social capital my parents had spent a decade cultivating evaporated in less than 60 seconds. The illusion of the wealthy, aristocratic Torres dynasty was stripped away, revealing the desperate, greedy core underneath. I sat in my metal folding chair, breathing slow, even breaths. I did not feel a rush of triumphant adrenaline. I felt the steady, calculated peace of a mathematician watching an equation balance itself perfectly. The variables had aligned. The stress test had broken the foundation. The junior event coordinator standing near my table shifted uncomfortably. She reached out, preparing to pull the silver tray and the blank document away, sensing the catastrophic shift in the atmosphere. "Leave it," I said, my voice quiet but firm. She snatched her hand back, stepping away into the shadows of the kitchen hallway. I looked at the blank quitclaim deed resting on the silver tray. I looked at the heavy black leather purse sitting on my lap, containing the recorded county deeds, the biological patents, and the federal emails. The universe had delivered the undeniable truth, broadcasting it in bright red letters for the entire city to witness. The lie had been broadcast to the world. The audience was paralyzed, waiting to see what the invisible older sister would do now that the spotlight had shifted. My parents were exposed, but the final structural collapse required one last push. The lie has been broadcast to the world, but how will I deliver the final fatal blow to my family's fragile ego? I unclasped the brass hardware on my black leather purse. The sharp metallic click echoed faintly in the hushed corner of the ballroom. I reached inside, pulling out the heavy manila folder. I picked up the silver tray balancing the blank quitclaim deed and the fountain pen. I stood up, pushing the metal folding chair back until it scraped against the wooden door frame. I stepped out of the shadows. I walked past table 24, past the overflow seating, past the dim perimeter, and moved directly toward the center of the grand ballroom. 200 guests tracked my progress. The sea of heavy silk and tailored tuxedos parted automatically, creating a clear, unobstructed pathway down the main aisle. No one spoke. No one reached out to touch my arm. They watched me with a mixture of raw curiosity and profound apprehension. I reached the front of the room, approaching the small, elevated stage. Vanessa was still standing there frozen, her hands gripping the microphone stand, her silver gown shimmering under the crystal chandelier. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a frantic, pleading desperation. She wanted me to fix it. She wanted the older sister who had always absorbed the damage to quietly step in and save her from the consequences of her own arrogance. I did not stop. I walked up the 3 carpeted steps onto the stage. I set the silver tray down on the edge of the podium. I reached out and wrapped my hand around the microphone. Vanessa did not resist. Her fingers uncurled, slipping away from the metal shaft. She stepped back, retreating into the shadows of the stage, shrinking away from the bright illumination she had craved all evening. I pulled the microphone from the stand, holding it steady. I looked out over the sprawling, cavernous room. The faces of the local politicians, the wealthy socialites, and the Horizon developers were turned upward, waiting for the final verdict. I did not feel the crushing weight of public speaking. I felt the cold, clinical clarity of presenting a final structural hazard report. "Good evening," I began, my voice projecting through the speaker system, low, even, and devoid of all emotional heat. "My name is Dr. Cora Torres. I am a soil microbiologist. I study the invisible networks that hold ecosystems together. It is a quiet profession, one that rarely requires standing on a stage. But when you discover a fatal flaw in a foundation, you have an ethical obligation to explain the load-bearing math before the walls collapse." I looked toward the head table. Sylvia had collapsed into her chair, her face buried in her hands, her carefully styled hair disheveled. Richard was staring at the tablecloth, his jaw clenched rigid with cowardice, unable to meet the gaze of his peers. For the past week, this family has celebrated a historic $10 million commercial real estate transaction. I continued my tone, remaining perfectly flat. My sister Vanessa claimed to have brokered the sale of our legacy ranch to Horizon Technologies. My parents have spent the last 7 days collecting congratulations, throwing expensive galas, and spending a massive, non-refundable escrow deposit. I opened the manila folder. I pulled out the crisp, heavy pages of the recorded county deeds. I held them up, letting the bright spotlight catch the official blue ink of the government's stamps. "They sold an illusion," I stated, dropping the heavy pages onto the white linen tablecloth of the podium. "They sold a product they do not legally possess." A low collective gasp rippled through the front rows. The local politicians leaned forward, straining to see the documents. 5 years ago, the Torres Ranch was 3 days away from a county tax foreclosure due to severe financial mismanagement, I explained, looking directly at my father. To clear the default and save the physical house, I utilized my personal savings and a federal grant. In exchange, I executed a legal severance. I purchased the deep agricultural rights, the mineral rights, and the subsurface water covenants. My name has been recorded on those deeds for half a decade. My parents retain only the surface topsoil. They own the grass. They do not own the earth beneath it. I turned my attention to Vanessa, standing trembling near the stage curtain. When my sister brokered this transaction, she outsourced the title sweep to a junior assistant, I said, dissecting her professional failure with surgical precision. She only checked the surface register. She assumed the mud beneath the grass was irrelevant. She did not realize that a mega data center requires immense industrial cooling capacity, which relies entirely on deep subsurface water rights. Rights she could not legally sell because I own them. I looked down at the lead tech developer, Marcus Sterling. He was standing near table 2, his arms crossed over his chest, his expression grim and calculating. Horizon Technologies did not make a mistake, I noted, addressing the executives directly. They operate under a strict federal mandate requiring a proprietary biological water filtration system. They targeted our acreage because my active pilot project, the exact fungal matrix required to secure their zoning permits, is already thriving in that soil. They assumed Vanessa was representing a unified family partnership. They assumed my signature was guaranteed. I looked back at the crowd, scanning the silent faces of the Tulsa elite. "Tonight, my family orchestrated a public ambush," I said, gesturing to the silver tray resting on the podium. "They attempted to use the pressure of this gala to force me to sign a blank quitclaim deed, surrendering my biological patents and my life savings so they could secure a fraudulent $10 million buyout. They wanted me to smile, stay quiet, and let them pave over my life's work to fund their vanity." I picked up the blank quitclaim deed. The heavy stock paper felt stiff between my fingers. I held it up to the microphone. I gripped the top edge and pulled sharply downward. The sound of the thick paper tearing echoed loudly through the speaker system, a crisp, violent rip that sliced through the silent ballroom. I folded the halves together and tore them again, dropping the shredded pieces onto the silver tray. "I will not sign away the foundation I built," I declared, my voice ringing with absolute finality. The silence in the room was absolute. The local socialites stared at the shredded paper, their champagne flutes forgotten. The illusion of the wealthy aristocratic Torres dynasty was annihilated, pulverized into dust under the bright lights of their own expensive party. Marcus Sterling stepped forward, moving away from his table. He did not ask for a microphone. He did not need one. His voice carried across the silent ballroom, hard and resonant with corporate authority. "Dr. Torres is correct," Marcus stated, addressing the crowd, his gaze locked entirely on Vanessa and Sylvia. "Horizon Technologies requires the biological patents to proceed with the Midwest expansion. We engaged in this preliminary surface contract under the explicit assumption that the Torres family was acting in good faith to support the federal environmental mandate." He paused, his expression hardening into cold disgust. "It is now abundantly clear that this family is actively hostile to the primary asset holder." Marcus continued his words, striking like hammer blows. "We do not conduct business with fraudulent brokers, and we do not participate in coercive extortion tactics." He turned his back on the head table, looking directly at his team of developers in the front row. "The surface contract is terminated, effective immediately," Marcus announced. "The $10 million offer is rescinded. We will engage directly with Dr. Torres and the Federal Oversight Committee to secure a new operational site." He signaled his team with a sharp nod. The Horizon executives stood up in unison, straightening their suit jackets, collecting their briefcases. They turned their backs on the grand gala and marched toward the heavy oak double doors exiting the ballroom without a single backward glance. The deal was dead. The corporate buyers were gone. The $10 million windfall vanished, evaporating into the humid Oklahoma night. Sylvia let out a strangled, sobbing gasp, collapsing forward onto the head table. Vanessa sank to her knees behind the podium, her silver gown pooling around her on the carpet, her hands covering her face. Richard sat frozen, staring blankly at the shredded quitclaim deed, his mind finally breaking under the weight of his own profound cowardice. The social assassination was complete. They had invited the entire city to witness their triumph, and instead broadcast their absolute ruin. I set the microphone down on the podium. I picked up my black leather purse, turning away from the stage. I walked back down the center aisle, moving through the paralyzed crowd, exiting the grand ballroom. I stepped out into the warm evening air, the gravel crunching under my clean, polished shoes. The deal is dead. The family is publicly humiliated. But the true devastation lies in the math. What is the catastrophic legal fallout of spending a 7-figure, non-refundable deposit on a fraudulent contract? Before I pushed through the heavy oak double doors of the country club, I stopped. I turned my body around and walked back toward the head table. Sylvia was weeping into a white linen napkin, her shoulders shaking. Richard was staring at the shredded legal paper scattered across the silver tray, his expression hollow and vacant. I looked down at the woman who had spent my entire life treating my existence as a shameful secret. You can live with the surface, I told her, my voice steady and quiet. I left them sitting in the wreckage of their own making. I walked out into the warm Oklahoma night. The valet brought my battered field truck around the circular drive. I climbed into the cab and merged onto the dark county highway. I rolled the windows down, letting the wind rush through the interior. For the first time in 34 years, the suffocating weight of my familial obligation was gone. The air felt lighter. The stars looked sharper. Let us fast forward 6 months. In a theatrical stage play, the curtain drops after the climax, and the actors go home. But in the realm of corporate law, the end of the party is merely the beginning of the audit. The poetic justice of this story was not orchestrated by vengeance. It was executed by simple, relentless arithmetic. The 7-figure escrow check Richard and Sylvia received from the developers was not a gift. It was a good faith deposit tethered to a preliminary commercial contract. That contract contained strict disclosure contingencies. By concealing the severed subsurface deeds, my parents and my sister engaged in documented financial deception. When Marcus Sterling and his team walked out of the ballroom, they did not just return to California. They activated their litigation department. Within 72 hours, a fleet of corporate attorneys filed a comprehensive civil lawsuit against my parents and Vanessa's brokerage firm, citing breach of contract and intentional fraud. Horizon Technologies demanded the immediate return of their earnest money, but the funds were already gone. Sylvia had funneled thousands into non-refundable catering invoices and custom golf clubs. Richard had signed binding high-interest leases on luxury vehicles. They had lived like royalty for a single week, spending capital they could never hope to replace. The legal retribution was swift and clinical. My parents had no liquid assets left to hire a competent defense team. They were forced to face the corporate lawyers with a court-appointed mediator who merely managed their surrender. The regional judge reviewed the undisputed evidence and issued a summary judgment in favor of the tech firm. The court ordered the immediate liquidation of the Torres estate to satisfy the debt. The new luxury trucks were unceremoniously towed from the driveway in the middle of the afternoon. The Tulsa Country Club Board of Directors, terrified of being associated with a public fraud scandal, quietly revoked my mother's membership and banned her from the premises. The final blow fell on a chilly Tuesday morning in November. The county sheriff seized the surface deed to the 500-acre ranch. The property was scheduled for a public foreclosure auction on the courthouse steps. I attended that auction. I did not go alone. I stood beside the legal representatives of my Federal Research Trust. Because the property was inextricably tied to my deep environmental covenants, and because the local market knew the land could not be developed without my consent, there were 0 competing bids. My institutional trust purchased the surface acreage for literal pennies. We acquired the manicured lawns, the paved driveways, and the sprawling ranch house for a fraction of its imagined value. The legal severance was erased. The soil and the surface were reunited. My name was permanently stamped on every single layer of the property. My parents were forced to pack their remaining belongings into cardboard boxes. They relocated to a cramped 2-bedroom apartment in a drab suburban complex on the outskirts of the city. There are no crystal chandeliers there. There are no wraparound porches to host luncheons. They are forced to sit across from one another every single evening, facing the hollow reality of the partner they chose. Vanessa's downfall was equally profound. The commercial real estate industry relies entirely upon reputation and meticulous due diligence. Her failure to perform a basic title sweep, combined with the public spectacle of the aborted transaction, rendered her radioactive. Her boutique agency fired her before the weekend was over. The state licensing board opened a formal inquiry into her ethical conduct, resulting in a heavy fine and a multi-year suspension. Bradley, her arrogant fiancé, possessed the survival instincts of a rat fleeing a sinking ship. The moment the lawsuit hit the local papers, he broke off the engagement. He packed his pastel polo shirts and his sockless loafers, abandoning Vanessa to deal with the fallout alone. Today, my sister sits behind a laminate desk in a dismal strip mall, answering phones for a low-tier insurance agency. She drives a modest used sedan. She no longer wears crisp white blazers. Meanwhile, the native Oklahoma soil is thriving. My federal grant expanded significantly following the public validation of the project. Horizon Technologies secured a separate parcel of Barron County land a few miles down the highway to build their data center. They contracted my research institute to construct a sprawling subterranean filtration matrix connecting their cooling towers to my fungal networks via miles of underground piping. We transformed the old Torres Ranch House into our central administrative headquarters. The formal dining room where my family once sat mocking my education now serves as a climate-controlled storage facility for sensitive microbiology samples. The grand mahogany table was replaced by stainless steel workbenches. The crystal chandeliers were removed in favor of bright, practical fluorescent lighting. I walk the acreage every morning before the sun comes up. I check the moisture levels in the lower basin. I monitor the growth of the mycelium creeping beneath the topsoil. The land is healing. The water retention rates have doubled since we began the expanded trials. The ecosystem is functioning exactly the way nature intended, filtering out toxins and sustaining life through the harshest dry seasons. I spent over 3 decades trying to earn a seat at a table that was constructed on a foundation of lies. I thought if I fixed enough broken things, if I absorbed enough quiet insults, my blood relatives would eventually recognize my worth. I learned the hard way that you cannot engineer love from people who view you as a utility. If there is a lesson to extract from the wreckage of the Torres dynasty, it is a simple matter of structural integrity. Do not set yourself on fire to keep an ungrateful family warm. Stop hiding your achievements to protect the fragile egos of people who refuse to grow. The invisible work you do has immense, undeniable value, regardless of whether the people on the surface acknowledge it. When the storms come and the droughts set in, the paint on the house will peel. The luxury cars will rust. The superficial illusions will crack and crumble into dust. The only thing that survives the harshest seasons is a deep, healthy root system. Check your deeds, keep your receipts, and let the roots do the talking. If this story resonated with you, if you have ever had to enforce a boundary to protect your own peace, leave the word roots down in the comments section below. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Remember to hit the subscribe button, and I will see you in the next one.